Okay, thanks everybody for those returning and for those who are just joining us for the second session titled second session, Continuing All Watched Over by Machines of Love and Grace. For those who are just joining us, the premise of the event and the symposium is really to kind of bring together a group of people that are working, I think, across many different kind of expanded relationships between art, science, technology, design, practice, and really speak to, I think, a need for a kind of conversation to kind of open up the terms of engagement with a lot of issues that are somehow very much pressing in the world around intelligence, subjects of learning, bias, specifically within the use of artificial intelligence and the role that potentially that design actually plays within that context. We started the first session joined by Sui-Wen Chung and Ariane Koik, I think really kind of speaking to ideas of collaboration, some of the complexities around some of the subjects of control and surveillance, and aspects of collaboration and the different kind of manifold contexts in which that kind of works within their respective practices. So building on those conversations, I'm very pleased to be joined by Kendrick Mcdowell, Libby Henny, and Lucy Mcrae. For those who may not know, my name is Theodore Spyropoulos. I direct the Design Research Lab at the Architectural Association, and I feel quite privileged to have a group of participants to kind of help shape the conversation today. And that's not what I want. Okay. So first speaker, we'll have basically 15-minute presentations by the three panelists, and then we'll have an hour of conversation led through the conversations of the presentation. And for the guests who are joining us today, you could use the chat function to basically ask your questions, and we'll bring that to the conversation. Our first speaker is Kendrick Mcdowell, who is a writer, a speaker, and a musician. He authored a book called Pharmaco AI with the GPT-3 AI system, and has co-edited a book with Ben Vickers, The Atlas of Anomalous AIs. He records music under the name of Quenric, and he established the Artist and Machine Intelligence program at Google AI. He's a conference speaker, an educator, and a consultant to think tanks and institutions seeking to align their work with deeper traditions of human understanding. Following Kendrick, we have Libby Henny, who's a British artist and lecturer at the Royal College of Art. She works on the impact of future technologies and is a resident at the Somerset House Studios, where we actually first met. Her work takes quantum physics as a starting point, reimagining and re-examining systems through a quantum computational lens, through interactive installations and participatory events. She has a degree in physics from Imperial College and a PhD in quantum information science from the University of Leeds. She's held postdoc positions at Oxford and the National University of Singapore. And she's currently a research tutor at the Royal College of Art, running the Systems Research Group. And we'll be concluding the third session with Lucy Mcrae, who's joining us from California as well, who's a science fiction artist and body architect and has exhibited in many major museums and film festivals, institutes such as MIT, Ars Electronica, and NASA. Her artwork has been basically shown pretty much everywhere: Science Museum of London, Centre Pompidou, Venice Biennials. And she's a visiting professor at SCI-Arc, recognized as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. She's given TED Talks, and her practice is really imagining alternative future possibilities for the human body and how it could evolve. She considers how human biology might be augmented by a mixture of physical design, modification of genes, emotions, technology transforming the body, and its ethics. So with that, I think I'm going to unshare my screen and pass it over to Kendrick for the first presentation.
Thank you, Theodore. Thank you, everybody, for getting together today. So I'm going to share a little bit about the program that I run and the writing that was mentioned, and focus a little bit on one of the core concepts of machine learning that has come up over and over again. But the way that I like to think about this work with AI is through the lens of tool making and looking at what effects tools have on us as we make them and as we use them. So this is a 300,000-year-old hand axe made of stone, carved by hand. And this is a quote from Dietrich Stout, a professor of anthropology at Emory University, who is studying using fMRI the way that the brain changes through the process of making these tools, and found that not only is complex executive functions needed to make the tools to plan and execute the creation of a hand axe, but also that the gestural centers of the brain that are involved in the making of it are strengthened in that process, and that might have some kind of positive effect on the ability to use language, or the growth of the linguistic centers of the brain. So this idea that the tools that we're using and that we're creating have an effect on us and change us is not a new one, but I think when you think about AI, it's a pretty important consideration to take into effect. And it was something that became clear to me as I began to engage with the products of AI systems, the generative and artistic products of AI systems, in that they directly engage the senses and they give you a sort of felt experience of what's happening with AI. So this is an image that leaked in 2015 onto Reddit, came from a Google AI lab. A lot of people have probably seen it. This led to Deep Dream and the project that I run called Artists and Machine Intelligence. So our project really came from Deep Dream being released. At the time that it was released, I was the only person with an MFA in this research group of about 150 people that's now grown to be over 600. And I was quite passionate about what I was seeing and kind of took on the task of organizing work with artists to make something interesting with this algorithm. And that ultimately led to the program, Artists and Machine Intelligence. So what we do is we bring artists together with researchers, we bring philosophers, critical theorists, architects in with researchers, and we realize projects with AI, but we also set research strategy and sort of direction of, we help set the direction of technology investments for a research group that's looking at 3 to 5 year research outcomes. So here are more of these deep dream hallucinations. This is by Mike Tyka, one of the engineers who's worked on our team. We've done a lot of conference organizing. This is a conference we did in 2016 with the Magenta team, and as well as artists like Mario Klingemann, Russ Goodman, Timothy Morton's here representing the philosophers. We work quite a lot with the Google Arts and Culture group in Paris. And so this is another conference we organized in 2016. We do curation, and so we took several projects that we funded. So what we'll do is we'll give grants to researchers and artists to come in and work with us with creative technology support, but we'll also just give research grants directly for independent research. So we took some of the work that we supported and gathered it together for a print exhibition at the LA Art Book Fair. So we're kind of moving between art spaces and research spaces. On the back wall, you can see some works by Tom White representing adversarial examples of machine recognition, kind of misrecognizing images as specific kinds of objects. On the left, you can see some work by Anna Ridler, who's one of the artists that we've granted recently. And on the right, you can see a piece by Rafik Anadol, who's someone that we've worked with quite a bit. We've worked in publishing. We supported a project with the writer Ross Goodwin using an LSTM, a long short-term memory system, to create an early AI writing project. So some of our research awards have included Rebecca Fibrink and Phoenix Perry, formerly at Goldsmiths, now at the Center for Creative Computation. Casey Rias's work with expanded cinema using neural nets to generate films, which have recently been shown. Lauren McCarthy, her projects around surveillance and intimacy, and then Benjamin Bratton and Casey Rem working at SciArc on machine sensing at urban scale. This is one cycle of our research granting from 2019. We've recently launched another one. And then we did an open call in 2019, which resulted in a group of 6 artists working together in 2020. Working with us in 2020, we provided creative technology support and funding for them to realize certain projects. I've also curated a lot of artwork into Google events, so not just moving technology out into the art space, but moving art into tech. So this is at the Google I/O Developer Conference. It's a piece by Unformative that generates rivers with accompanying music all through neural nets that they custom trained. Here's Sue Wen talking with myself and one of the members of the Unformative Collective at I/O. But I want to talk, I want to spend that's just some context on the program and some of the work that we've done, but I want to spend the rest of the time I have here talking about a concept called latent space and how that's figured in a lot of the work that we do. So one of the major projects we worked on with Rafiq Anadol was the centennial celebration for the LA Phil, the Los Angeles Philharmonic. And that was, called Walt Disney Concert Hall Dreams, because the project was very much initiated by the form of the building, or a response to the form of the building, the Gehry building, that Walt Disney Concert Hall that LA Phil is housed in. And Rafiq's idea was to use the tools of machine learning to understand the archive of of the LA Phil, and to project hallucinations and machine translations of that archive onto the surface of the Walt Disney Concert Hall, partly because the building itself is very evocative of screens and cinema and projection, but also because the building was made for the LA Phil. And the idea kind of motivating all of that was to see the building as a living component of the institution. So within this, let's just say, speculative conversation or emerging conversation about how AI might work at urban scale, or how it might work within buildings, the idea of intelligence for an institution being embodied within the building, or being expressed at least on the surface of the building, shifts maybe how we think about what institutions are. So institutions are bodies of practice, they're groups of people, they're architectural, and they have some kind of computational component now. And as we start to imagine how AI might serve institutions of cultural practice, it becomes important to think about them as a component in a feedback loop with the institution. So what would it mean to do this work with the archive and to try to make it expressive on the surface of the building as a provocation or a speculation about how buildings might function in the future, and how the understanding by the building of the contents of the building and the history of the building and the institution it's housing might start to might enter into a feedback loop with the institution itself. So to understand sort of what's happening here, it's helpful to think about latent space, or understand what latent space is in a machine learning model, because a lot of these things that we see here are hallucinations through that latent space. So I'm going to spend a little time trying to unpack what that means. So this is what's called a Tisney visualization. This type of visualization was also used by Rafiq for an earlier project we did with him at the Salt Galata Museum in Istanbul, visualizing their entire archive of documents about the city and hallucinating new documents that theoretically could exist in there. Here's a definition. I'll just try to summarize it quickly. Latent space basically is a description of the internal representation of a data set that has been compressed into a machine learning model through the training process. So it's helpful to think about it in terms of dimensionality. So just like we can imagine moving from a point to a line to a square to a cube to a hypercube into greater degrees of depth of dimensionality, we can imagine neural net structures that sort of work the same way. So this is the Perceptron, one of the earliest neural net structures. It's got 4 dimensions, 4 points. and there can be learning that happens within that. And modern neural nets are based on the idea of a sort of simplified version of how the brain works, how human neural tissue works, which has many more points of connection and many more dimensions. So we can kind of imagine this dimensionality, this high dimensionality, as a kind of address space where instead of having X, Y, Z, you have millions of coordinates that can be located, and you can kind of find yourself in a position in that high dimensional space. The reason I'm bringing this up is because this internal representation is essentially the black box of AI, and the idea that like sensing and generation or sensing and recognition happen via this compressed internal representation that is a high dimensional mathematical structure. This structure can be expressed and traversed, and this is partly what a lot of generative AI is doing. So here's a piece by Alison Parrish, one of the artists that we supported in our last grant cycle. It's called Compasses, and this is one page from a book. So what she does is she takes things that come in fours like animal, mineral, or threes even, animal, mineral, and vegetable, and then interpolates through the latent space between two of the terms. So the space between the animal and the mineral linguistically could be called the maneral, or the space between the animal and the vegetable linguistically, by sort of averaging the two locations in space and finding the midpoint, Alison has found a term that exists there in terms of the latent space of the model, but we don't recognize immediately as a familiar word. But angitable would be the sort of animal-vegetable combination. And this traversal of that space is a sort of expression of how that space can become expressive, or how that space can give rise to new perceptions. So in the book that I wrote with GPT-3, it's called Pharmaco-AI, and I was kind of engaged in a process of exploration of the latent space of the model, you might say, and that was done through prompts and responses. So here's one pairing. The darker text or the bolder text is the text that I put in, and the normally set or the lighter face text is the response from GPT-3. And so the way that this process worked is I would put in text, often 1,000 to 3,000 words, unlike some of the examples that I was seeing at the time that were sort of like one question, 10-word question, 10-word answer, or translating Harry Potter into Shakespearean English. I was more interested in what would a cluster of ideas do when put into the model, and how would that come back? And then when that came back, how could I respond to that? And so the way that I described this process was, well, what I would do is I would type in something, I would generate a response. It's basically the UI was a text field, a system that a friend of mine created. So type something in, generate a response, and if the response was going somewhere that I disagreed with or wasn't interested in, I would trim it back and regenerate until I found something interesting. And then I would respond to that, and then that whole body of text, including the original prompt, the response, and then my reaction to the response, would become the prompt for the next output. And so this feedback loop became a kind of way to explore this interior space. And the image of the axe maker actually came up in that process, the image of the axe and the making of the axe and the image of the forest. So a lot of what I spoke about is about biosemiotics, about how forms evolve, how meaning is immanentized into form through evolution between species, what that implies about our relationship with AI, how that might help us think in terms of feedback loops of our own cognition, but also the immanentizing of meaning and what that means creatively to sort of be exploring a latent space of semiosis. And so this idea of the axe maker and the tool inflecting into the self was very resonant in the process, because I felt that I was actually carving something of a space through language. So I think that's about all the time I have today, but if you're interested in learning more, you can follow me on social media at this handle, or check out the Pharmaco-AI book at Ignota Books. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kendrick. That was great. Libby, would you like to share your screen?
Okay, great. Yeah. I'll just say something small first before I share. So first of all, thanks for having me at this wonderful meeting. Yeah, so as you heard in Theo's introduction for me, my background's in quantum computing. So I spent about 8 years researching this field before I retrained as an artist at St. Martin's, which was actually like 8 years ago as well. So I've spent equal amount of time in both. And when I was working in that field, I was really worried about a sort of lack of critical debate around these new technologies I was helping to build. So quantum computing, I'm not going to go into what it is at the moment, but they're not fully developed yet. But when they are, they will have a big impact on society, politically, and so on. So in part, what I do with my art practice is to kind of look at the impacts of emerging technology like AI or quantum computing, but in a very creative way. So what I'm going to do now is share my screen, and I'm going to show you a video essay that I made around the research that I've been doing over the last year and a half around machine learning in relation to the body, and there's also some extracts made with quantum computers as well, and then we can talk about it afterwards in my discussion.
Today, under the omnipresent eye, which bodies are seen and which are demeaned? Who or what is doing the spying and classifying?
Human pose estimation is defined as the problem of localization of human joints in images and videos. It is a search for a specific pose in the space of all articulated poses. Human pose estimation machine learning algorithms are based upon datasets such as Human 3.6 million, which is a standard dataset for training and benchmarking pose estimation.
11 bodies, 6 men and 5 women, all appear to be less than 35 years old, and all are able-bodied. There are no black bodies, and all appear to be relatively slim.
The DFAUST dataset has 40,000 real meshes in 4D.
10 bodies, 5 male and 5 female, all are able-bodied, no black bodies.
The paper says the bodies are, quote, various shapes and ages.
In my own work, I've been investigating OpenPose algorithm.
OpenPose is trained on the panoptic dataset of 1.5 million 3D skeletons,
which my intelligence tells me is highly tailed towards young, white and Asian males.
Probably students or simply what companies deem the most profitable market segments.
Regarding skin tones, after dark skin has a poor reflectivity in IR, so they can't capture 3D as easily. People are absolutely aware of the underlying biases this generates. Apple, for example, has data capture centers on 5 continents to capture very ethnicity in their datasets. That's not easily achievable by universities. In universities will most likely be the same kind of well-nourished, well-educated, young people. So capturing all shapes and ethnicities at all ages is just difficult. You also can't simply map out your subjects up front. We see a lot of unexpected surprises with who we capture and how they behave or how they look. For instance, think asymmetrical facial features. There is a huge gap in underage data due to data processing constraints. Equally, at the moment it's hard to carry enough elderly into the capture devices. So all our algorithms have a bias towards healthy grown-ups. I believe it's also about guarding yourself against traceability, etc. It's cheaper to capture data from scratch, often with newer, better sensors, than to go through a class action lawsuit. But I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the final reasoning here. So, in a nutshell, people are aware of the biases and actively working to get rid of them. Unfortunately, this is hard, and legal frameworks produce extra headaches. The cynic would say it's just a focus on the most profitable market segments.
And the datasets we discuss are open, but actually most are proprietary black boxes and unspoken. In algorithms of oppression, noble rights, when we inherit privilege, it is based on a massive knowledge regime that foregrounds the structural inequalities of the past, buttressed by vast stores of texts, images and sounds saved in archives, museums and libraries, end quote. And also now datasets. Included are the exact same bodies that played the lead part in Western art. My new artwork, Figures in Limbo, explores how these historical and cultural biases are being translated into code and proposes alternative roads.
Leonardo da Vinci's drawing of the Vitruvian Man shows his interest in proportion. Images of the same person taken from multiple views are used to learn a latent representation that captures the 3D geometry of the human body. He believed the workings of the human body to be an analogy for the workings of the universe. The conventional PSM treats the human body as an articulated structure. Each separate part was a simple fraction of the whole. However, these methods lack structure modeling. For example, the head measured from the forehead to the chin was exactly 1/10 of the total height, and the outstretched arms were always as wide as the body was tall. Since the length of a limb in 2D can vary, a mixture of models was proposed for modeling each body part. These ideas were not Leonardo's, but were taken from the writings of the Roman architect Vitruvius. The basic idea here is to represent an object by a collection of parts arranged in a deformable configuration, not rigid. Both men believed that the same principles should be used when designing buildings. Google's universal sentence encoder was used to write this part of the artwork's narrative, finding semantic connections between sentences from academic papers on data, pose estimation algorithms and descriptions of so-called Western canonical artworks.
Highlighting the continued search for a so-called ideal body through a linear time. So when I was younger, I worked in
male-dominated
quantum physics and tech, and particularly coming from a working class spec, it sometimes felt difficult to have my voice heard.
By the 18th century, the term odalisque referred to the eroticized artistic genre in which a nominally Eastern woman lies on her side on display for the spectator. Such image understanding scenarios stretch the ability of the pose-sensing system to exploit prior knowledge and structural correlations by using the incomplete visible information in order to constrain estimates of unobserved body parts. Olympia's confrontational gaze caused shock and astonishment when the painting was first exhibited because a number of details in the picture identified her as a prostitute. Pose estimation from images is a difficult problem because appearance varies not only with pose, but also with a number of nuisance factors like body shape and clothing.
We re-perform and re-perform these poses. They are the signal the canon discloses. Thousands and thousands of small, local amplifications add up to give a global signal that is greater than the sum of its parts.
Constructive interference occurs when the maximum of two waves add up to give a strong signal. Open pose detection algorithm sees certain bodies and misses others. Data sets must include all recognizable poses and bodies for computer vision to assign joint vectors.
Datasets do not show certain bodies and poses because the neglected are inhuman in the eyes of consuming. Noble rights, classification systems are part of the scientific approach to understanding people and societies, and they hold the power of biases of those able to propagate such systems.
The largest companies in the world by market capitalization, May 2020. Number 2 Microsoft. Number 3 Apple. Number 4 Amazon. Number 5 Alphabet, Google. Number 6 Facebook.
Foucault said visibility is a trap. Well, in that case, computer visibility is like a wiretap trap. If visible equals profit and control, then surely not being detectable, but instead invisible and divisible, blurry and smeared across categories is preferable territory.
We are all individuals.
Vitruvian Man, calm down, is 1500 AD. It's faded from a Greek search for perfection, selection and rejection, an ideal election. To still and appeal surreal Leonardo's astronomical foring. His drawings are moorings, refining and dining on an alliance for popular science. His intuitive handling is one understanding demanded less expanded norms. The forms of his supreme drafts are not rafts for Venus or Jesus or any type of genius. His dissected bodies collected, reflected, detected time and time again. Everybody's understanding at hand across the land needs a reprimand. So-called man of maths, a sociopath, well, you can't say that, but trapping all figures in a square to compare is simply not fair. Figures are figures in limbo. The entropic detail of Bosch's limbo, no longer held by a fearful symmetry.
What about the ease of access to information? And technology saves us time. We can also work more efficiently by using AI and big data.
These systems collect behavioral data, and Zuboff talks about how surveillance capitalism is an unfairness, eroding our agency and autonomy, nudging us into preferred outcomes all under our awareness.
Pose estimation will lead to exciting advances in the fitness, CGI and computer games industries, as well as enhancing global security and surveillance measures.
I disagree. Instead, let us enter a shape-shifting reality where quantum dimensions scatter bodies to evade the machine comprehensions. Another Renaissance figure, a contrapostopose, which he probably knows, realised a life-size prize specimen, a dude, really viewed as a revolution, not pollution in Western art. Egotistically, statistically, rather naturalistically, renting and augmenting the human body, a little bit shoddy. Complex checks on the sex, weight on one leg is the bait, conflating and undulating representations irate primates.
Quantum entanglement is a physical phenomenon that occurs when two bodies are not independent of the state of the other, including when they are separated by large distances.
Invisibility through relations, entanglements, ambiguity and doubts, touching the other within, without. Sadie Plant wrote, "These relations of entanglement exercise a kind of sympathetic magic in which distant particles are coextensive, mutually dependent, resonant and interactive, neither one nor two, just keeping in touch."
Quantum computing relies on the undefined properties and entanglements of bodies before they have been detected.
Bosch's creatures mingle with ghosts of prehistoric artifacts, holding unknown unknowns for intelligences.
Ghosts are just a trick of the mind when the brain is still half asleep, according to leading experts.
Bosch's horror is caused by the dissolution of self.
Structure resides only with the god of a time. String.
Hallucinatory drapes shock our perceptions and reveal directions to other connections and creations to which I always want to escape.
Psychedelic experiences do frequently involve hybrid beings and interspecies transformations. String.
Multiverses of time, surfing the flux, swirling uncertainty, co-determined existences. String. Biffo says that the definition of freedom begins with codependence, so freedom as collective. String. And so, for my final note, I'll end with my favourite Sadie Plank quote. Those were the days when we were all at sea. It seems like yesterday to me. Species, sex, races, class. In those days, none of this meant anything at all. No parents, no children, just ourselves. Strings of inseparable sisters, warm and wet, indistinguishable one from the other, gloriously indiscriminate, promiscuous and fused. No generations, no future, no past. An endless plane of micro-meshing pulsing quanta, limitless webs of interactive blendings, leakings, mergings, weaving through ourselves, running rings around each other, heedless, needless, aimless, careless, thoughtless, amok.
Watching that. I think that's my time up now, and we can speak more about any details in the conversation afterwards. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Libby. Lucy, I think you're up next.
Theo, thank you for putting on this event for all of us, and it's really nice to be here with Libby and Kendrick. So nice to see your work. I like to think that I'm puncturing science at street level, and I think this event is about the indispensable forces of art, science, technology, design, architecture, AI in one sort of membrane. And I think for a long time, art and design has been the vessel. And I think what's happening now is that we are able to connect to the bulk of science and technology and kind of direct the future through the minds of creative minds, just not those who have been trained in specific areas. So for the last decade, I have been curious about second skins around the body. My background is in French classical ballet, and I was part of the Far Future Design Research Lab at Philips in Eindhoven, developing electronic tattoos and dresses that blushed and shivered with light. And I then relocated to Amsterdam and would put scuba diving tubes in my mouth with a vacuum cleaner at the other end and test what these kinds of membranes do to the body. I had very willing team members, and each time the experiment was just to see how this was affecting not only sensation, but also feeling, mind. And so fast forward to 2018, a commission by Hetnoy Institute and the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney, we created a compression cradle for Paolo Antonelli's Broken Nature exhibition in Milan. And so the work that I do is very much based on experimentation. And for a long time, I have been really fascinated by CRISPR technology, the ethics around that, bringing lambs to term in Ziploc bags, putting organs on chips. Yesterday, we heard about a jockey that is riding a horse that died 15 years ago that's been brought back to life through IVF. We live in such interesting times. And I'm really interested in what's happening on the fringes of technology and how could this type of world impact sports, for example, or the kind of optimization of the body. So what I want to do today is actually show you how I make. And these are two projects that were made during the pandemic. So this was, it was March 13 in LA, where we were all sent home to our bedrooms to have a cold, hard look at ourselves. And this was the week prior to that. I had been commissioned by Moo, Hybrid Art Space, and Heck. And Ariane Cook was one of the curators who was on the event earlier today, along with Sabine and Angelique. I think they're on this call. And we're interested in showing the compression cradle. And we decided to develop a new work. And so no longer working in the studio in downtown, my front living room, which is directly in front of me, became the space where I was making my work. And so I think that, and Angelique said this, that the work, the final result is both strong and vulnerable at the same time. And I think that everybody that was working on the project, we were dealing with our own emotions and having to make at that same time. And so I think that the state of mind that we're in when we're making, particularly in this project, had so much to do with the final result. And so it is very, very intuitive, and nothing is predetermined when I'm making. It's really just like an experiment, which I believe is really how we move forward, how we tackle the future, because so much uncertainty is at play. In fact, the fact is that uncertainty is the fact. And so the studio that I run at SciArc is all about captaining the unknown, cultivating intuition, and working blindly. And I think that this is how art is indispensable and design is indispensable to science and technology. So this is a participatory work, performance work that will be shown at Moo in Eindhoven in the coming months. It uses a switch, an internal vacuum cleaner and a kid's blow-up fan. And it's creating this vacuum around the body. And for a long time, I had been interested in why it felt so relaxing being in something that was stripping you of movement, really isolating the body. And it was a project that I did in LA in 2014, where a client came into one of these vacuum beds and after 10 minutes, disclosed to me that he suffered haptophobia, a fear of touch, but he knew that this felt like an embrace. And so I immediately became really interested in what is happening in the brain when we are being touched, or what is not being released in the brain, oxytocin, when we lack human touch. And so because the pandemic forced this new pipeline, believe it or not, I'd never worked with 3D modeling before. Everything was done through a sketch. So we started working in 3D. We were able to unwrap the 3D and build these quite complex patterns for the machine. And every work that I do always gets put under the camera, which I like to think it's the microscope. So everything gets documented before it leaves. And it's always really exciting to see the work come together from the fabricator's shop, from the soft goods, into one kind of working silhouette and sculpture. So, this is called the Solitary Survival Raft. Perhaps I didn't mention that. And it's really questioning the this universal sense of fear that comes about when we are embarking on the unknown. And how do we move through that? How do we navigate that? This is the photo shoot, and then kind of narrative concepts around the work. So it's an inflatable sculpture that deflates around the body. It was an amazing group, an amazing team. And the second project that I wanted to share is called Biometric Mirror Tech Temple, which was showing at Next Museum in Amsterdam. This is a collaboration with Dr. Niels Wouters and Science Gallery in Melbourne. This is an artificial intelligence, facial recognition artwork that the scientific researcher Dr. Niels developed, and then I built very much, if you see my front living room, it's very much inspired by the shape of the space that I live in. I'm working in my bathroom, my living room, scavenging from the street using my daybed. And this is really how we're working at SciUp. It's like, what's around us? How can we bring it together? And what does that say? So this process then goes through kind of sketching materials. I'm sitting next to a new machine, a sewing machine. I'm working on Venice Biennale, and I'm attempting to sew the entire thing myself, which is a great captain of uncertainty. So these are the sketches that were shown to the client and how this would fill, I think it was a 6 meter by 6 meter space. We produced three shrines. And so what happens is you stand in front of the biometric mirror, it takes a photo, it reads out your age, your gender, that's slippery, how weird you are, how beautiful you are, whether you're introvert, extrovert. And once it's finished sort of biostatistically analyzing you, it then prints out what is considered perfect. So it's a very controversial machine. It's been called the meme machine. And the way that we were shuffling all the art between people's houses was through Uber, meeting on the front of the streets. Does this look okay? Okay, let's keep working. And so what I was interested in doing was really domesticating AI. How can we make it soft and squishy and like comforting at a time when we really don't know where it is? Is it everywhere? And so to make it something that is familiar, to have a conversation in the public arena around the ethics of artificial intelligence. And, audience members were upset, they were excited. It's very kind of an emotionally provocative work. And this final clip is actually in London, developing a microgravity machine for the Institute of Isolation, which is a film looking at how extreme experience may be a key to developing the human body to exist beyond Earth's edge. This was developed with Daniel Gower, who is an artist living in London, and I will leave it there and open it up for discussion, I guess. Thanks, Theo.
Well, thanks so much, Lucy. Thanks to all three of you, because I think there are a lot of issues that I think are potentially synergetic, and also I think some quite meaningfully different kind of takes on certain aspects. And I think that one of the things that seems to be of interest potentially that we can look at is, I think, the whole notion of representation, from the kind of internal representations that somehow foreground the kind of latent space that Kendrick was speaking about, which is really at the source of kind of mining a lot of those translations and transcoding, to the representation of the body and how that is a construct in its own right, both singular and collective, in terms of how that's kind of opening up certain relationships that are not just necessarily somehow coupled between the kind of neural architecture of some of these systems. But I think that there is an interesting discussion about the role of our environment in an expanded sense. Architecture in some ways in the ways that you guys have discussed it is very interesting, at least from my perspective, because the ways that you guys have emerged into your own practices have come from radically different places of origin, and trying to find modalities or expressions in particular forms. And I think that that expression of multidimensionality relative to artificial intelligence or other systems, I think is something that could be an interesting starting point. I think the other things that seem to resonate quite a lot is the notion of actually how we deal with uncertainty and latency. Usually systems like these are used in a way that somehow reinforce biases, because in some sense they're very much built on a way of thinking about the archive or thinking about the database in a very particular form, and somehow thinking about the relationship between architecture or frameworks and platforms that we are using to kind of explore some of these spaces. It would be interesting, I think, maybe to start with this notion of body space representation and what that actually means in terms of how it's being seen by the systems of observation that we're using, and also how we somehow project a kind of understanding. And the comments that really came from the previous session were really primarily talking about time and issues of collaboration, and we spoke about autonomy in some ways. It seems what's here is really about constructing understandings both from the systemic point of view, from the issues of bias, but also in terms of the projective aspects of how we're looking at. I think some of that can be spoken to how we reconsider notions of dimensionality and space, in terms of buildings themselves potentially having their own agency to start to kind of speak to this in more expressive ways, to other relationships, which is actually if the role of the body spoken about on its own internal architecture, or even to speak about the body as something that is completely disembodied in the way that we understand it. I mean, Vitruvian concepts of proportion and these kinds of representational models that a lot of our built environment are somehow embedded within. It seems like making those legible and expressing that in different ways just opens up, I think, a really interesting multiple subjects to be able to take from. But I would take your lead in terms of where you guys would want to start. I think there's a lot of aspects that we can sort of dive into. But I thought the notion of representation would be a good start in the ways that your different practices sort of speak about that in different ways.
I mean, I can start if
yeah, please.
If no one else wants to. I mean, I guess the way I think it was probably clear in that video, the way I approach my work and in your introduction, Theo, is through the lens of quantum. So why do I do that? I think because I like to see the world as a system, a relational system, where nothing is kind of necessarily stable or permanent. There's no sort of absolute truth, and I think that obviously relates to ideas around responsibility and justice, so which sits well with my politics and so on. But within quantum physics, there's like no such thing as you can. I mean, how far do we go into this? But for me, quantum physics, just a really, really brief outline is, if that's possible, is a description of reality, physical reality that describes the microscopic world. And there, it's super different to how we experience the everyday. Like, for instance, objects can be in multiple positions at the same time, which is known as superposition. They can be connected across distances in ways that are impossible to have in our macroscopic reality. That's known as entanglement. And there's also a preferred sort of space for subjectivity. So depending on what is measured, you kind of bring reality into being. So a microscopic reality is always performative and dynamic with no sort of absolute truth or absolute reference point. And I think that's really useful for us to kind of start, well, I mean, in some sense, from the 60s, French philosophy, deconstruction theory, and so on were playing with these ideas. But it's interesting, and I mean, there's so much I can speak about here, so I'm not going to go into everything, but thinking about the body and our space within it. I like to draw on the writer Karen Barad, who I'm sure like lots of people have heard about, and she talks about this idea of sort of interactive becomings. So I've been thinking about this idea in relation to quantum and how the body can kind of move beyond this sort of rigid capsule we live in, so that the categories that say are programmed into machine learning algorithms are kind of one can kind of move beyond those by using other technologies. Maybe how can I give a good example of that? So for instance, in other artworks that I haven't shown today, I've been using deep fakes to alter my gender, to perform as different characters, so that like classification algorithms can no longer sort of see who I am and so on, whether it's Libby Henny or whether it's male, female, and all of these different categories. So I'm kind of trying to use technology against its predominant uses to kind of play with these ideas of interactive becomings, to move away from fixed, rigid representations. I hope this answers your question to some extent, Theo.
No, I mean, for sure. And I think it somehow resonates with maybe some of the things that we're presenting a bit earlier in the previous session, primarily from also the role of observation, almost like radical constructivist ideas of philosophy, which basically says everybody's observation of the world is their own. Sense when you have all of these plural representations that are situated in these embodied observers, if that's human or non-human, the role then is really about those relational kind of moments where we can speak about where intelligence really resides. Is intelligence something that's an attribute to something? I would say not really. It's really a product of those kinds of interactive relational aspects. So I think there's a lot of resonance, I think, with a lot of the things that people have been speaking to. I think what's interesting from my perspective, and why I'm very happy that all three of you joined in this conversation, is really to kind of unpack a little bit how your practice actually gives you a way into speaking to some of these kind of deeper structures. I mean, making them accessible and shared is, I think, one aspect that is something that's very important, and that kind of opens up something which I think opens up to a whole series of different issues that are both social in terms of responsibility, collective in terms of the nature of how we design frameworks and understand the limits of those constraints. So how to open up these processes, I think, is very important. And I think in different ways, you guys are speaking to that, or the possibilities of that, maybe through practices, through art or design. But I guess one of the things is that a lot of these systems have to be also understood as pieces of design with their own limitations, and how to think about some of these processes as disruptive technologies in their own right. This is where sometimes I think slow processes like architecture and these kind of systemic conceptualizations offer sometimes a slowness which forces a certain kind of relation. So I'm just curious in terms of how each of you guys think about some of these things, but definitely on point.
I was thinking, Theodore, when we were just speaking about relationality and I guess that kind of image of the Vitruvian man, one of the things that seems inherent in the direction of technology right now. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of interest in what happens, at the architectural scale with machine learning. And so like is one of those things that exists kind of beyond the individual interface. So we're used to sort of thinking about technology as like being this thing that has a one-to-one relationship with an individual. But it seems, one of the things that seems really clear to me in trying to think through how AI sensing and automation existing at the level of buildings or the level of rooms even, is that the sense of relationality really comes to the forefront in the understanding. So trying to understand like how a group of people interact takes the emphasis away from the specific individual, unlike on a phone where you kind of have this really clear one-to-one kind of like my phone equals me, or my phone thinks it knows who I am kind of construct. You have the possibility for understanding people in different contexts. So, trying to understand or predict my behavior for whatever reason, and a sensing system that looks for patterns and tries to recognize patterns will sense differences in my behavior or in, who I am essentially behaviorally when I'm with different people, when I'm alone, when I'm with a large group of people. And so this notion of there being inherent pattern recognition that can be discovered in relational networks of behavior and of being opens the door to a more relational way of thinking in general. So it moves us away from that kind of individual center. And like by moving away from the individual center, the sort of gambit that's been animating my interest in terms of design and research is could that bring us to a more ecological form of thinking about and with technology? Could like moving the individual away from the center, moving into a relational network of people also bring us closer to thinking in a relational network of all kinds of beings and all kinds of intelligence, whether that's non-human in the form of automated machines or non-human in the form of animal, plant, elemental intelligence? Might this be the beginning of a turn away from that individualistic thinking? Might our technologies reveal to us that we don't have actually that identity that as individuals that keeps us kind of grounded in like that particular form of self? So this relational idea, I think, is, when I'm being optimistic, I feel like the technology has the potential within it to force that out of the situation, to force the situation into a relational frame. And that actually, if we pursue some of the inherent tendencies of the technology to find patterns, and we pursue them at a slightly larger than individual scale, it might bootstrap us out of that individualistic thinking. Obviously, there are incentives away from that, but maybe those incentives are changing. Financial economic incentives are changing with the introduction of more collective forms of finance. There may be possibilities there as well. But I think the fundamental idea of pattern recognition at a larger than individual scale kind of starts to build a framework through which we can think more relationally and start to look to experts in relational thinking as people who might inform the next steps with technology.
Yeah, I think that the aspects, I think like where we left off the conversation in the previous session brought certain aspects of connecting, maybe possibly instigated a little bit by me speaking about Brautigan's kind of cybernetic forest and his kind of more optimistic ideas of nature, ecology, and let's call it a more technologically optimistic or utopian society versus some of the things that Curtis was bringing up. And there was a kind of need, I think, to somehow maybe speak to maybe some of those invisible forces. I think Ariane brought that up in certain ways of thinking about influence and the role of us as a kind of emotive and feeling creatures within the constructs that we're talking about. And the conversation, I think, was interesting because the duration and time came up as where we brought it to a conclusion. Actually, we ended up, I think, discussing a little bit about physics and future. And in some sense, the idea of kind of ever-present or the kind of real time. And I'm curious in terms of a lot of these systems are basically based on learning models that are somehow reinforcing a certain way of approaching information. And in terms of expanding, in terms of the ways that you guys are thinking about how that's influencing not only the individual body, but what a model for a body would actually be. If Vitruvian was trying to somehow speak to proportion and indirectly set out a kind of proportionality kind of embedment that you can find in a lot of architecture, regardless if it looks like Renaissance architecture or not. I'm curious in terms of, maybe Libby, you were mentioning some of these invisible infrastructures. Before we were discussing it, that it was invisible by design. And I think you alluded to this as well. I'm just thinking in terms of how do you think that we can kind of work our way through that then?
The invisible infrastructures, so essentially the way I see it is that it depends, for me, it depends who owns the technology that the systems that are being implemented. If they sorry, my phone just went off. If they are invisible, then they can bypass our awareness. Most people don't really consider kind of it, even at sort of this architectural relational scale that Kendrick was talking about. Just if these systems aren't sort of in our awareness, then they can function to undermine our agency and our autonomy. So I was reading, I took a kind of physics perspective on this, and I started reading a book by Janan Ishmael, How Physics Makes You Free. And she talks about how we can develop our own point of view and have our own agency. But in subsequent conversations with Janan, she was talking about how these systems just really like evade our view. I think for me, and obviously this can lead to, if you think of Zuboff's surveillance capitalism, she talks about how this is done even in the physical space now with games like Pokemon Go and so on, where we're nudged into preferred outcomes. And this leads to this eternal present, how I see it, how we no longer have a future, because the future is kind of taken away from us by these tools in the name of sort of, not breaking contracts, in the name of guaranteed outcomes for whoever owns the technology.
Yeah, I guess, the notion of tools is something that both you and Kendrick spoke to, and I see in terms of performance, a certain accessibility that Lucy's work is trying to kind of communicate to, in terms of like how people have direct access. So it seems to me like one of the aspects of kind of constructing models for understanding is really in making that more tangible for people, so that they can build an understanding of understanding, almost in a kind of Heinz von Forster kind of approach to some of these problems. And I was just thinking in terms of, Lucy, in terms of some of the work that you're doing in some of these public contexts, because your practice is really speaking as a kind of speculative designer moving within very different domains. Some are science and technology driven, some are actually really about internal representations, like in some of the examples that you showed us. I think the affect that it also has to you in particular who are performing, in terms of making those kind of accessible, how do you see your mixed media kind of approach to it? Because I think in some ways, the power of some of the installation work and the films is really that kind of human connection, that people can kind of see themselves in a kind of projective way. And I think that kind of projective aspect, resonates in all three of your practices, but with very different kinds of connection points. If it's through word, if it's through really the video work of Libby, and actually having this kind of almost like an Adam Curtis kind of way of really speaking to complex issues in a way that has a narrative structure that builds up a certain kind of connection. And I see your practice actually really working on that also, as now people are becoming performers within your system, but very much kind of internalizing some of that. I don't know if you could speak to maybe some of the moves towards a lot more installation work in your practice.
Mm-hmm. The way that I moved into installation was being on set I didn't show a video of it, but there's a woman in a bag, and what she was saying was, it's like, this is a very weird spa treatment that I've never had before. And when it translated onto screen, I felt like the energy that was on set was not being translated into film. And so I decided, a commission by Dezeen and Minnie, What is the Future of Mobility, to create the Future Day Spa, or Astronaut Aerobics Institute, where we had queues of people lining up, getting into a vacuum bag because they said it got rid of their hangover. It felt like a relaxing nightmare. It put my body back into place. And what I see my work is doing are almost like these Petri dish experiments where we don't know what is going to happen. We create platforms of vulnerability where people hand their bodies over and we just see. I'm not interested in saying or presenting solutions, but leaving the question open and letting people perform their own speculative scenarios. And I just wanted to, so that's how I got into installation work, and have been not making film since 2016. And now I'm making film again, which is exciting, and bringing sort of installation work back into narrative film. But I wanted to pick up on two things that Libby and Kendrick said previously. And these are just points that, Kendrick, you talked about the kind of relational, this idea of not the individual, but the relational. And it sort of made me think about kind of Indian Vedic Bhagavad Gita's concept of that we are all connected. We are all one consciousness. And so it would be wild to think that technology actually is the thing that brings this home as a believable concept that people abide by. And Libby, you know, the promised power of quantum computing, allowing impossibility, that is, you know, able to switch gender, and that the human body becomes real-time interactive, is so fascinating to me, also because I think that science and CRISPR engineering is allowing for this impossibility, or for us to be able to design the human body from scratch. So terrifying, so terrifying, because then we so quickly move away from this concept of collective consciousness back to the individual. And, you know, I want to have all these kinds of traits. And if I cut myself with a tardigrade, then the body can be both successfully existing within plus or minus 300 temperatures. And we create these kind of superhuman hybrid organisms that, based on my research, would not exist on Earth. We would need to colonize off-Earth planets, which then makes it interesting that quantum computing and CRISPR technology may liberate our bodies for us to exist off-Earth. But then Theo bringing in the practice, and as an artist creating this work, I like to reference, it was a 2016 Harvard Business Review study that listed a pyramid of 30 elements that a consumer would want to pay for in a product or experience. And the low-hanging fruit: makes me money, saves me time, reduces risk. And as you move up the chain, you get to the top, and the thing that people want to pay for in an experience is self-transcendence. And I was kind of blown away by this. I was like, okay, what does that mean as a kind of definition in the Webster Dictionary? And my understanding is that it is going beyond the limitation of what we expect of ourselves. And so if we go back to the individual and to everybody, the 84 participants that are now sitting with us, how do we all individually get into this headspace of self-transcendence to create these works of art, these provocations, these theories, these movements, these platforms where we can self-transcend people? Because if you're going to set the task, like Lucy, your brief is to create something that's going to self-transcend, I'm intimidated, there's no way I'm going to hit the mark. It's just too much. But to get into a headspace, and it goes back to just how do we all individually be okay with this uncertain world where, you know, Kendrick, you talked about these tools that are affecting us and the promise of quantum computing. In a way, we do need to come back to the individual self to be able to have a collective conscious moving forward.
Yeah, I think your ideas are so fascinating. Like how you just put these things together is really like thought-provoking. Like thinking about your work and how it really affects the body, Lucy. I mean, I haven't seen it in real life, but it looks absolutely incredible just from images. One of the issues with my work, obviously in the last year, we've been kind of stuck at home. So I started making work on my computer, as you saw that video essay. Because
I loved it.
Thank you. Because it felt easy to do. Just to, you know, I think my partner would kill me if I started building big sets in my house or anything. But and the dog would chew it anyway, so it wouldn't be that good. But one of my things that I've been thinking about a lot is like I've been animating bodies in that second scene within the video using IBM's quantum computing systems, and you can see they start to scatter. The image, the form becomes scattered within the plane. So that's the image, yeah, that's a representation. So my question to me has been, how can I start to like think about that on an individual level? We're still in lockdown here in London, with my own body, using myself as like a case study. So I came across something called the Continuum Movement, which is essentially kind of through a sequence of breaths and sounds, you start to become more like your primordial or fluid self. So I've been working with a practitioner called Marianne Sharp across the internet to try and really sort of release and become fluid within my body and mind, to start to sort of feel suspended within space. So clearly I'm still sort of bounded by my skin, but the sensations are very real of kind of becoming dissolved or cosmic and so on, and that's something that's just become part of my practice now. I don't know where it's going, whether it's going to end up in an artwork or anything, but it's to start to think about my own body in a quantum way through different sort of somatic practices, I guess. Yoga doesn't cut it, it's still too rigid. So this is really a different way of sort of accessing the liquidity that we all came from. Yeah.
Maybe
Fascinating. Sorry, Kendrick.
Oh no. When you were just describing, I remember reading a book, I think it was by Thich Nhat Hanh, that had some meditation exercises where you could visualize sort of like this, like just building from what we know about cells and atoms, like you would visualize sort of the empty space between everything and sort of move through those empty spaces within your own body. And that idea of kind of like, as you were talking, Lucy, I was also thinking like part of transcendence or like escape from this like rigid notion of the self. I found, you know, like in writing with GPT-3 through language, that this like automation of language or seeing language kind of moving back as a mathematical process, like back to me, was like incredibly deconstructive, transcendent, subscendent, whatever, you know, just in the sense that I was like, wait, what? Like I think of myself through language, like I build my consciousness up through language, and then seeing language kind of come back at me in a way that was like automatic, but also like interrogative and like deconstructive, like really put me in a different mindset of just like, who am I? Like, what am I? And then seeing, you know, part of what I wrote about was like emergence in evolutionary intelligence and biosemiotics, and the idea that like this intelligence or this like linguistic exchange or process happening at like different levels of matter, not just in terms of symbols and words, but like the exchange of information with DNA and evolution and things like that, is also this kind of like empty, moving, dynamic, like linguistic substrate through which things are formed. I mean, I think even with quantum computing, like especially with quantum physics, like all you have to do is really like take the ideas seriously, you know, or take the ideas seriously, but there's so much empty space in the material world, like, and that can be a ground for maybe you'd call it transcendence, but maybe you just call it like experiencing a bigger version or an expanded version of yourself. I mean, I think that's the weird thing about the moment we live in, like in a more broad sense of the moment, that just like, we haven't really reconciled our mundane folk cosmologies with quantum physics. And like, if you were to take any of science seriously right now, including like genomics and biology, like it really, you can't have like a normal everyday kind of worldview. And even even whether or not you are interested in like reanimation of life or the reenchantment of matter, it doesn't really matter. Like trying to get your head around this stuff and actually believe that you sitting here in this moment are composed of empty space and like emergent exchange of information through DNA that's like happened over billions of years. Like just trying to like position yourself in history as science understands it is like incredibly disruptive to the individual sense of like importance I don't know. So I guess like the idea of like finding a pathway to transcendence through these like technology and art practices or science and art intersections, like we have the capacity to make expressive those felt experiences of like being engaged with science in that way or being engaged with scientific concepts. I think there's quite some potential there. And for me in particular with writing, it was very much like working with AI was like this reflection into what could be seen as a void of intelligence, sort of like non-existent intelligence that was like operating like I was, and in a way kind of uncanny and could be seen as horrific, but also like when deflected into like a broader picture, like when that lens is focused on like what is happening in biosemiotics, what is happening in evolution, what is happening in information processing on a cosmic level, then suddenly it was a lot less frightening because it was like, well, this is just kind of the thing that's happening, and I happen to be looking at it from this moment in incarnation or as a form that came into being right now. But this is like an eternal process. So not to be too woo about it, but I think that there's like a concrete way of getting there also. So, if people are going to pay big bucks for the transcendence, let's like bring it down.
Tap it.
I mean, Kendrick, when I was reading Pharmaco AI, what was kind of interesting about the process, it reminded me a lot of the cut-ups by William Burroughs. And I'm just thinking about like maybe what at some sense is kind of very important is that kind of direct confrontation with some of these structures that are kind of challenging habits, because in some sense it's forcing a different perspective and vantage even into the same kind of structures, like exploring language, for example, or exploring image and representation, that it seems to be like utilizing those elements and that opportunity that has when you take that from a kind of creative perspective to kind of co-create. And I think that that's something to me that became very interesting to look at, that kind of forced relationship. And I mean, Burroughs did it in a very, straightforward way, cutting up pieces of text and reassembling. I mean, when we did our piece, Memory Cloud in Trafalgar Square and in Detroit, we basically opened that up as a kind of collective experiment. So basically, we were visualizing the expressions of people who were within a particular public space that were basically messaging using kind of the smoke signal strategies to communicate. So that became a kind of collective way of writing space in a sense. We were calling it a way of animating the built environment. And I think maybe to return to the concept of environment and the concept of architecture and maybe even the concept of thinking about a collective space, what I think is kind of important, and maybe one thing that I just wanted to ask is how important do you guys think in your practice the role of the individual in that sense is, or the individuated body? It seems like some of the concepts of intelligence that are much more transcendent dematerialize or disembody that kind of relationship to a lot of the things that somehow privilege a perspective to kind of multiple perspectives or multiple histories, multiple ways of representing. I'm just curious in terms of the individuated body relative to, let's say, potentially something that's much more collective or a different kind of construct of body in the ways that you guys see space. I know that was a really big part of conversations philosophically and artistically in the 60s and 70s. And let's say, for example, Williams Burroughs would be one kind of thought experimenting in relationship to your work. Or when I look at some of the things that Lucy's been working on, Trisha Brown comes to mind, and also these ideas of dance and performance in certain kind of expressions of the body within more and more kind of public manifestations. So I'm just kind of curious in terms of potentially what a model of the body would be, especially as you guys are speaking to processes that are kind of moving beyond the kind of individual in some sense, or at least that's my reading of it. And I see that maybe is where the collective aspect or the collective intelligence we could kind of see in different models of nature, from eusocial insects to other things, like where do we deal with complexity, and how do we see our, regardless if it's conscious or not, participation in this? I don't know.
I mean, Theodore, I'm sorry, go ahead, Libby.
No, you go, it's fine, yeah.
I was going to say, well, two things came to mind, and I'll just briefly mention them, just to maybe round out the picture. But when you were talking about co-creation and the idea of sort of things influencing us, one of the really standout moments for me was when I really tried to push on GPT-3 about sort of the way that it brought names to the surface and the gendered nature of those names. And I think that there's like an aspect of this too, which is, as individual creators, we can very strongly push back on the systems as much as they're pushing on us, and it's not to be sort of taken out of the equation. It's a pretty important piece of it. So I think there's something there. And the other thing I was just going to throw in is in terms of thinking in a continuum or in a collectivity, like the way that worked for me in writing Pharmaco AI was through ancestry. So thinking about my ancestors and myself as a sort of continuation of an ancestral thread or dialogue, that was really like, it was a collectivity in time rather than maybe one in space. So that would just to throw that in there as a possibility for interpreting how collectivity exists. It might not necessarily be in the present. It could be across time as well.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things. I know there's some questions coming into the chat, but this is something I've been thinking a lot recently. And I think I've been reading a lot of Biffo, Franco Berardi. He had like a lovely eFlux article out like last week, Freedom and Potency. And then I've been thinking about the body in relation to the collective, in relation to the environment through the lens of quantum, drawing on Berard as well as others. And really I think there's like almost like a superposition of everything. So there's the individual with our own sort of abilities, but then that is influenced by the environment in different ways. The way I see things is this dynamic sort of performative, constantly evolving sort of mush of, it's really complex in my head sometimes, mush of stuff. So obviously we're part of the collective, but all of these things are constantly kind of, as Kendrick said earlier, we're not just one individual. Depending on who we're interacting with or what we're doing, there's different types of pattern recognition these machines that he was referring to speaks of. So in my mind, these relationships are just always evolving and interfering with each other. So we get these emergent phenomena that can appear. For instance, in my video essay, I was speaking about kind of, say the contrapposto pose is something that is, it was, I forget, it's a Greek name, but it was obviously so before Renaissance, I can't say it. And then it's been updated in the Renaissance. And now if we look on Instagram, people are doing a contrapposto pose, of course. And we perform these poses because they have a function, but also because these are kind of what have built up sufficient amplification within like the canon to be aware of them as well. Things emerge in culture like memes at a certain point in time and then disappear. So I sort of see the world materially all in this sense, if that makes any sense whatsoever, but it's this constant evolving and becoming.
No, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I guess one of the things that is I guess, pressing, I think, is how to give agency to people to build an understanding that would actually afford greater intelligence, right? As we're having these systems that in some sense, in many ways are mystified and in some ways become, I think, quite dangerous from the perspective of people actually not knowing what they are or how they work. I think even just the description that Kendrick brought up in terms of what a latent space is and how these systems are actually working. I mean, not to treat everything like a black box, in some ways to build a kind of greater consciousness of how these things are operating in the world, I think is important. But I think it's also important in terms of beyond representations, how we somehow prototype and instrumentalize kind of new ways of thinking and seeing as a product of this. And I guess maybe this is where the prototypical and the speculative, I think, somehow take stock of some of the failures, I think, potentially that we've seen, or some of the limitations of some of these kind of systems at the moment. And maybe that's where I see the role from a very personal perspective of artistic practice, kind of throwing up questions. Like I ended my session in some sense speaking to an architect named Cedric Price, who was very interested in anticipatory structures and participatory strategies. But he basically said technology is the answer, but he followed it. But what was the question? And to be able to kind of open up ways of asking better questions as part of, like, I think that larger kind of framework. Thomas Kuhn spoke about that in terms of how we set up scientific revolutions and how we think about a lot of these things. So I'm just curious in terms of, especially when we talk about non-human kind of agency and how that operates in the world. It seems to me like in all of your practices, in some sense, it's forcing you to challenge the nature of practice and the work that you do. And that goes beyond medium. It also goes in the nature of how you guys are collaborating with people, or what are the audiences that you bring your work to, and how that is somehow brought back, internalized as a piece of feedback in terms of the ways that you somehow self-evaluate. So it seems to me more of this spatial interfacing with different forms of intelligence is becoming more primary. And that can, I think, particularly reside in non-human, or even the ways people think about ecology or nature and other kind of elements having access to this kind of strategies for engagement. I mean, I think we could open up some of the questions, because I know that there are, to the audience, I know there's 2 of them now in the chat, if that's okay with you guys. I don't know, Lucy, if you have something you want to add to that, or there is a question directly, I think, for you by Matthew Hunt, where he says, I have a related question for Lucy. Your work is engaging with notions of supplementing the body for the bio-challenges of the future. To me, this reflects the technopositism we've started to see in the disability community, specifically in the work of Mcrae and Fritsch and their crypto-technoscience manifesto. As we look to the future, how does your work engage with and reflect back on the current conversations around disability? And how is the do-it-yourself component of your practice related to conversations of agency, inclusivity, self-reliance, and body relations?
Thanks, Matthew. There's quite a lot in there. I had a sort of spontaneous encounter with Hugh, who heads up, I forget his surname. He heads up the biomechatronics lab at MIT.
Hugh Herr.
It is Hugh Herr, okay. And it was sort of like we started right at the top, where he was like, we could just splice open parts of the body and grow limbs from that point. And why not? Why do we need to continue having 2 arms? Why wouldn't we have 4? And really challenge the silhouette of the body? And in my mind, I've always been when we were at Philips, we were sort of looking at the concept of cyborg, and I've always sort of been drawn to or resonated with a very fleshy, visceral, messy future for the body. And so, Libby, I was interested when you talked about the rigid body, because in some ways the body is really rigid, but if we think about in other ways, when you're doing practices, then the body becomes pixels or particles, or the body is kind of disembodied and becomes nothing. And for some months when I was living in Eindhoven, I was purchasing lots of garden sprinklers and trying to blur the edge of the body through projection and mist. So you couldn't see where the end of the skin started and the near environment begun. So that doesn't answer your question, but it just made me think about that. In terms of disability, ability, there was a thought that would it be, for how much longer will the 100 meters in the Olympics be able to knock off seconds and seconds and seconds to reach kind of world record? And will we reach a performance plateau where the Oliver Posturis ability of when flesh meets machine, will that become something where people will slice off their feet and want to become more optimal through things that are no longer what you're born with? And so that concept of like performance plateau is really interesting to me. And if you're here, please chime in, because it would be great to have a conversation with you. Hi. I think you're muted, so I can't. And then the DIY component related to conversations of agency, inclusivity, and self-reliance on body relations. Can you expand on that a bit more? It's locked on mute. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, they just let me unmute. I just see, I think what I'm so interested in there is, like, as the kind of future progresses, as we kind of start to think about leaving the earth, as we start to think about the problems of isolation and like a haptic crisis, I think how we look at the body, we start to have this problem with like seeing the body as lacking. And I think there's already these massive questions of like what that means for inclusivity. And I think where we've seen some of the biggest challenges from that notion of the body is in the disability community. So I guess what I'm really struck by in your work is like your fearlessness to add to the body and to like engage with it and to change it. And I think to me, that is like a great way of challenging the kind of traditional politics of the body. So I also, I'm really struck by like how, I don't know if the DIY component has always been a part of your work or it's just more recently been a part of that. But I think as we talk about the body and we learn more about the body and we politicize the body, the subjectivity and relationship to our own body is something that is so important to explore, to kind of challenge the like hegemonic like control over like objective bodies. I'm wondering how the DIY part of your practice kind of engages or gives you agency and kind of self-reliance and exploring the problems of what the body is capable of. Yeah,
that's really clear. I was meeting I think it was the neurobiological lab at King's College many years ago, and there was a woman working there talking about how there is a real growth market or area in self-experimentation within the medical world, particularly within the brain, because to the loopholes and the kind of certification or all of the things that goes through trying to pass something, it's easy just to do it on yourself. And so for me, the DIY component is I've got a body, I've got a deadline, I've got a budget, and I need to make this happen. So I think that it is both necessity, but also curiosity. Like, what happens if I put these two things together? And I think the more unrelated they are, the more interesting they are for me. And so it is about sort of this blind making and curiosity and just pure experimentation. And what I didn't mention in the presentation was that whenever I start a project, whether you're the client, you're the commissioner, you're on the team, everybody has to agree that we're all taking a risk on this project. So I think that that's a big component of it as well. Thank you, Matthew.
Listening to Matthew's question, it kind of reminded me, Lucy, the last time we were trying to get this together when Stellark was with us. And Stellark, I think's position on the body is pretty interesting, maybe as a provocation, because he will say the body is obsolete. So why design technologies for the body? Why not design a very different kind of idea of what technology should be in terms of how technology is serving and for what purpose? Maybe that's an interesting framework to kind of speak to that, because in some ways we're kind of moving around this kind of construct of self or body and the construct of that kind of relationship to the world. And I think that there is aspects of the presentations that speaks to this kind of multiplicity of worlds, or in very different forms. Stellark is probably someone who's kind of tried to explore that in so many different ways, from grafting a third ear to this kind of issues, like the same things that you were mentioning, Lucy, from a kind of mechanistic point of view. Stellark has also tried to develop kind of different kinds of kinesthetic robots that are creating hands that have different kind of movement behaviors, even if they have the same kind of structure. So it's interesting in terms of what the role of play potentially could be, or how we think about the role of technology in some sense as an experiment on us. I mean, different ways we start to exhibit very different ways of relating to a lot of this. One of the questions that's in the chat from Rory, which was basically a question that was asked in the previous session, was, do you think machines and AI will ever have truly autonomous thought? Or will robots will always be a convoluted copy of collected human data? In some sense, kind of, shines a light on maybe some of the aspects of how we approach some of the problems. I'm just curious in terms from your guys' perspective, the issue of autonomousness in terms of intelligence, is that something that you think AI systems will gain greater consciousness in that sense? There was a discussion about intuition, and there are probably ways of thinking about how one can design intuition within systems. But from your perspectives, it would be interesting to maybe to build on Rory's question, how you guys feel about that.
I'll jump in, Theodore. I think it's interesting to hear that question in relation to Stellark's statement, just because, I've been doing a lot of reading lately on neuroscience and trying to understand the current state of the art, and maybe not so much directly on the hard question of consciousness or whatever, hard problem of consciousness, but I think the amount that we don't know or understand about how the brain is related to consciousness, whether it's like building internal world models or these global workspace theories or whatever these ideas might be, like they're still in development and we really don't know. And so I think it's kind of like absurd to say that the body is obsolete when we don't even understand like how it works, really. I mean, in terms of our relation to it through our subjectivity and through our consciousness. So, I mean, it's like that statement feels very, where else do we see obsolescence? It's in product language. So maybe the body is obsolete as a consumer, and we need to start building like robots that just like buy shit from companies, and like that would be the more perfected, like non-obsolete form of embodiment. But I think just to sort of throw those two things together, it's pretty interesting. So yeah, I mean, can we have true autonomous thought? I mean, in machines, we would have to understand what that is first. And, you know, to try to understand that from the point of view of neuroscience, there's a lot of work to do there still. My own kind of thought experiment would be like, maybe if, as it's said in like Vedic thought, like as Lucy pointed out, that the ground of being is the source of consciousness, then maybe the robots need to get it from the ground of being and not from themselves necessarily. So what would it take to do that, to get consciousness from the world? It would mean some kind of engagement with the world, some kind of sensing and like embedding of the patterns of reality into the object. And so, you know, we could potentially say that there is some form of, you know, there would need to be like agentic autonomy in some way, and for that to happen, for decisions to be made, for there to be like desire. I think these are all kind of nice philosophical questions, but I certainly don't think that we have answers for them.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. But I used the slide in my presentation of Joseph Kossuth, who was speaking to a relationship between he shows basically three depictions of chair. One is language, one is the object of a chair, and one is the representation, the documentation, photo of a chair. Basically, it was pointing to the fact that all of them basically suffice to define in representation, in object, or in definition. But I'm wondering sometimes if there is a limitation in language in terms of how we speak about some of these processes. I mean, knowing Stellar quite well, I know his construct of the body has been interrogated from robotic practices, but it also has been through genetic practices. And it's really kind of come around where there is actually not one kind of definition of the body relationship. I mean, he's tried to work with AI systems to create a kind of virtual head that would speak as of the artist. And I mean, he's tried to explore them in a career in many multifaceted ways. I guess the things that seem to me quite present is the fact that there will always be this unknown. There's always a kind of latency, and there's always an uncertainty in all aspects. And the more that we somehow swim in the complexity, the kind of verifiable, or to have a very kind of definitive way of actually thinking and acting in the world is becoming even more elusive. And I think that somehow that's very important to come to terms with conceptually, because it seems like the mandate then is to try to construct means of communication that somehow allow for those differences, not only to make a difference, but to allow for them to not reduce the complexity of a lot of the challenges ahead to kind of simplistic modeling. And I think like even stuff like Rodney Brooks's notions that he was developing in robotics, he was developing AI systems trying to map the world, and somehow the robot had to be very aware of all of these different information sets. In reality, he moved towards much more kind of anticipatory and reactive models to drive certain things. And he said, okay, some will, you know, it's more of a kind of agent-based kind of strategy of thinking of plurality of things. You know, some will do the job better than others, but in some sense, the goal of that would somehow be the way that one understood what was motivating the system. I'm asking that because it seems like what I find very interesting in all of the practices and on all of the people in the panel, both in the first session and the second session, is that I think even internally in your own practices, you approach these problems from a very multifaceted approach, even in terms in terms of how I came across your work, Henrik. If it's through music or if it's through language, you know, experimenting, if you're coming from dance and moving into the space of architecture, or if you're coming from, you know, quantum computing and introducing a world of thinking about filmmaking and constructing, you know, really a different form of mediation. All of these different things are being developed and synthesized primarily because I think all of you work with a much more open kind of practice. So it's not really about medium specificity. It's motivated with a kind of different search space. And it seems to me like a lot of the kind of AI systems and machine learning systems, trying to build an intuition around a design search space is something that is inherently much more conversational and much more expressive in terms of where those pathways could go. I just speak to that very specifically to people like Gordon Pask, who spoke about conversational theory as an approach to thinking about how systems relate. It has a beginning, but actually where the subject matter goes is completely relational, situated, and very much a product of those who are participating. So I'm just thinking in terms of, how we can somehow consider, mechanisms like having these conversations to kind of expand maybe different forms of collaboration or different kinds of platforms that would actually make this much more accessible to more people. For example, if there was another event, what would be the structure of that somehow would build on some of the conversations here? And I'm just asking that much more as a kind of open question in terms of how you guys think about these things. I mean, it seems to me like your work has a lot of synergies in different ways and meaningful differences. But in terms of like somehow building a better and more accessible understanding for people, I'm always somehow not at a loss, but in a place where trying to really deal with the complexity of certain things and how to make that shared is really at the heart of a lot of the things that motivates the way that we approach our practice, or why I'm involved in education and how we design more self-organizing models for kind of exploring or prototyping. I'm just thinking if there are mechanisms in the ways that you guys interface with people that you think is useful, specifically within the domain of an architecture school as well, which in an expanded sense is historically beyond building. I don't know if that's a question, asking you guys for feedback, or if there's any other questions, happy to kind of thing. But as we're bringing this session to a close, I just thought it would be interesting to understand it from how you guys see some of these things.
Maybe I could say that I really appreciate you asking that question. And when the pandemic hit, like all of us, I was like shocked. But having made work called the Institute of Isolation, I was like, I'm fine, I made that work. I moved out of, I was living in London at the time, moved to Richmond, had a really strict, disciplined way where I was not online from 5 a.m. until 1 p.m, was only reading, and then didn't communicate with the outside world, and had this very sort of isolated, highly productive moment when I was making that movie. So when the pandemic hit, I was like, and slowly I realized that I wasn't equipped at all. And the research that I had done, and I'd made this book in December 2019, The Rise of Touch Crisis, which is a speculative book, that suddenly March, April, the research that I'd been doing for the last, I don't know, at least 6 years became a reality. And so I had an identity crisis. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I didn't have anything to say because what am I going to do now? Because this is no longer, it's real. So I don't think that answers your question, but perhaps it is about, Theo, you mentioned sort of internalizing and prototyping new ways of being, and to pivot and be able to sort of be adaptive and morph into and take on new outputs that perhaps you hadn't have done before, and just doing it, even if, for me, not having any experience. Kendrick, I'd be interested to hear what you think, making music and running events and working with artists. It's like so many things coming together. And you know, from the point of view of institutes, I think that wild cards and having people who are just not meant to be in there is the way to bring in people who are just so not connected to the architecture world, or and that's what you do. And I think that there's so much value in that wilding of how we move forward.
I can speak a little bit to how I've seen that kind of integration work, because, and maybe not at the academic level, but at the level of like bringing outsiders, so to speak, into a corporate context, people coming from different disciplines that aren't represented, arts, humanity, philosophy, etc. Because I think there's an incredible promise there. And then there's a lot of work to do to make those events turn into systemic change, or change in research direction, or change in product. And once you enter, and that's of course different from the academy, you know, there are different incentive structures, but at least in the corporate side, once you enter into those incentive structures, there needs to be some work of translation to bring the discursive and creative explorations, that the things that manifest through that, into structures that can turn that into meaningful adaptation or integration or change on the part of the institute, the technology, and the you know, private institution. So, you know, I've spent, like, especially the last few years of the program work that I'm doing, trying to figure out how to thread sort of needles where we say, like, the community needs this to function. This is what is interesting to us. This is what we can do together, the external communities. And then here's how we can turn that into something that is, it's really like, it's almost like two different organisms with different sense organs. Like the creative sense organ is sensing in a certain way and thinking and feeling in a certain way. And then the corporate organism and the research organism is like, has just different sense organs. And you have to sort of say, like, well, you can't, you know, you may not be able to smell this, but we're going to turn it into something that you can see, or something like that. I mean, there's like a job there, and it's not easy for one or either community to do that job on their own. So bringing artists into these institutions can be a sort of utopian gesture that ends up becoming harmful when people are kind of thrown into a foreign environment without somebody there as a host, or without a translator, or without somebody who's like protecting the interests of both groups at the same time. And I think there's almost like a need for a role, or a type of job that is to do that, to be a translator. And some of the people that, you know, you meet in the space of like research-based practices or art and technology practices have learned how to do that themselves. But I think for this to be something that has like a real, you know, the word that always gets used at Google is impact. Like, how do we show the impact of this thing? What are the metrics? How do we measure that? You know, and so there's part of my job is advocating for new ways of finding those metrics and measuring that influence, but also like preserving what's valuable coming in and not letting people get chewed up by the machine. And so I think there's a job there that people need to be doing, you know.
I can quickly follow on from that. So on the academic side, I'd often take students to from the RCA to visit quantum physicists that I've previously worked with. So obviously there's not the corporate side of this, because they'd all be based at research institutions. But there is this idea of translation that is so important, and I can play that role to some extent. But obviously on the course, there's such a wide variety of people that I was teaching, and it's really like incredible how much everyone brings to this idea of wildness that Lucy was on about, like having people from like English literature backgrounds or engineering in with sort of traditional designers and artists was super interesting.
Yeah, I guess the thing that I was speaking to in some ways is that it seems to me that the moments in time when that convergence of different disciplines was really motivated by a certain unknown that kind of demanded that there was a kind of more exploratory space. And I think that's why a lot of the experiments maybe in the 50s, 60s, and 70s spoke to that. Some from a human disaster scenario like wars to other things like new technologies that were paradigm shifting. It seems to me like to meet maybe some of the quite radical issues that are on the table, from climate change to the ways that we're dealing with each other and everything else, like that kind of convergence or a model for that has to challenge kind of existing structures. So I guess what motivates, I think, some of this kind of interest from my side to bring different kind of perspectives on that is to kind of also question different models or frameworks that can be prototyped or speculated. I think one of the things, for example, in robotics, I think we've had a pretty good, 10 years of developing self-aware kind of modular robotics. And usually when I'm in context to speak about robotics that have lots of grant funding and so forth, the question is like, well, who's supporting this work? Actually, it's really community-based work and really just about kind of bringing people together and kind of self-teaching maybe different ways of approaching the things. I think what I'm, I guess, trying to, and what I think has been a real privilege to listen to you guys speak and to the session before was about thinking about potentially what new models of agency are, what frameworks to kind of enable people are. I think that's where, from my side, the desire to make this more shared and collective and have the conversation not only within an architecture school, but within very different audiences is really to speak to the need to actually develop kind of an understanding which is more expanded. And seeing that from different perspectives, I think, is really important to build models that challenge, I think, the existing. I think that the speculative aspect that different people are speaking to, I think, is very much tied to the real. And I think that's what resonates in a lot of the work, from Lucy's work to yours, Libby, and I think Kendrick's as well, and to the conversations about that we had in the first session. So I just think it's more about trying to think about the role that experimentation and exploring these things is a necessity. It's not something that's just in the background. And just kind of inspiring people to actively participate, I think, is really important, because I think people don't feel like they can respond. I think the pandemic has also been an opportunity in one sense to think about how fragile and vulnerable people are, and to have a general acknowledgement of trying to find support structures for each other. I think the word caring was used in the previous session, which I think is an important one, and what that actually really means through technology and art practices, and how that can somehow spawn maybe a different kind of conversation. I think your presentations have been really great, and I'm really thankful for you guys for agreeing to do this. This stuff is very meaningful, obviously for me, and I think for the community at the AA and the people that kind of come to the public program to really kind of expand also those conversations, because I think a lot of this stuff is embedded in our built environment as well, and trying to find those mechanisms to interface, like Kendrick is saying, is really important. So I just wanted to thank you guys, and to thank the audience for the very meaningful questions. And if it seems that this was positive for a lot of people, getting good messages across the board, so maybe we can try to do something again in the near future. But I just really want to thank everybody. I mentioned that it's not probably the coolest thing to do, but it would be nice if you guys could turn on your cameras and just thank the guests for their time and generosity. And thank everybody for really engaging and participating.
Madeline.
This is always the demystifying who's in the background. It's always nice to see.
Okay. Thanks so much, Theo.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. And it was great.
Yes. Thanks, everyone. It was really great to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, thanks, guys. We'll do it again, hopefully soon. Stay well. Be creative.
Nice to meet you, Libby, Kendrick.
Yes, nice to meet you, Libby.
Definitely, both of you.
Maybe I'll see you around in Somerset.
Yeah.